It was only when the Ukraine crisis broke out in February 2014 that the United States and its allies suddenly began describing Putin as a dangerous leader with imperial ambitions, and Russia as a serious military threat that had to be contained. What happened? This new rhetoric was designed to serve one simple purpose: to allow the West to blame Putin for the outbreak of trouble in Ukraine. And now that the crisis has turned into a full-scale war, it is imperative to make sure that he alone is blamed for this disastrous turn of events. This blame game explains why Putin is widely viewed as an imperialist here in the West, even though there is hardly any evidence to support that perspective.
So NATO assumes that it can move to anybody's border without complaint or response. If you want to know why this war occurred, that's it. That's the one sentence explanation. The rest is details.
Since 2014, the United States has provided Ukraine with $2.4 billion in security assistance, including $450 million this year alone. We are committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, and that is unwavering.
A scandalous episode of close to covert U.S. support for neo-Nazism in Ukraine. Explain what's going on there.
Yeah, the Azov Battalion is essentially a militia that's grown out of the Patriot of Ukraine party, which was a neo-Nazi white nationalist party founded by a street demagogue named Andrei Beletsky, who has pledged to restore the honor of the white race, in his words, through his national or social national party in the Ukrainian parliament, advanced laws forbidding race mixing, this kind of thing. And the Azov Battalion became active after the civil war began in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, when pro-Russian separatists sought to secede, partly because of the neo-Nazi incipiency in Kiev. They didn't want any part of it. They speak Russian. Their language is not going to be recognized by the new government. And so the Azov Battalion was ultimately incorporated into the country's National Guard and military through the Ministry of Interior, through Arsen Avakov, who has been basically a supporter of its agenda all along. He also at one point installed another figure from Patriot of Ukraine, Dmitry Yarosh, as the police commissioner in Kiev. This is another neo-Nazi figure. And, you know, all along we saw these denials, especially in 2014 during the Maidan so-called Revolution of Dignity, which was actually a right-wing nationalist coup against a democratically elected government.
But if Russia attacks Ukraine, we will be united in imposing severe consequences on Moscow for its actions, including high-impact economic measures that we have refrained from using in the past. And at NATO, we are working closely with allies to prepare to reinforce NATO's defenses on its eastern flank as that is needed. None of us seeks confrontation or crisis.
Робота буде, у них немає. У нас пенсії будуть, у них немає. У нас піклування під дітей, під людей, під пенсіонерів, під дітей буде, у них немає. У нас діти підуть до школи, до дитячих садків. У них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах. Бо вони нічого не вміють робити. І так, і саме так ми виграємо цю війну.
Certainly, the Russian people don't need it as they come out of a difficult COVID period. Diplomacy remains the best route to settle the conflict in Donbass and address any other problems or grievances.
President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov have repeatedly indicated that they seek to deny any potential path to NATO membership for Ukraine and other Eastern European countries. Does the administration view this demand as a valid issue for negotiation?
No, we do not. And President Biden made that point crystal clear to President Putin today that the issue of who joins NATO is an issue for NATO to decide. It's an issue for applicant countries to decide, that no other outside power will or may have a veto or a vote.
And we have a fair right to ask frankly, who is this expansion against? And what happened to the assurances given by the Western partners after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are these statements now? Nobody even remembers them.
I'm sorry I was there at these instances. I was actually there. Professor Kachanovsky is the world expert on what happened at the Maidan. I was there the day after because I was asked to be there by the next government, and it was explained to me how the U.S. NGOs, so-called, funded the protests on the Maidan, paid for it. Oh, we'd feel great if the Chinese paid for the January 6th demonstrations in Washington. We'd say, oh, that's just fine. Well, the United States paid for the Maidan, but you won't read about it in the New York Times.
Democracy is a process of self-determination. So if everything about your movement in your country is being determined and is dependent on Washington, then you're not involved in democracy at all. You are a vector for foreign interference. Foreign interference, involving yourself in another nation's political independence, is a violation of the UN Charter, the most basic of all international law. And if people don't believe me, if people think like, well, what the NED is doing is not all that bad, funding groups overseas, promoting democracy, promoting opposition groups, promoting media involved in a nation's internal political affairs, organizing petitions to rewrite a nation's constitution. If people think that's not bad, just ask yourself this: would the US tolerate another nation doing that to them? The answer is no. And this is the ultimate proof that what the US is doing through the National Endowment for Democracy is wrong. The US knows that it's wrong. The US doesn't care. They don't care that other nations are having this done to them, while the US itself would never tolerate it being done to them. Now, Angela, that quote you just referenced to Carl Gershman, this comes from New York Times, Missionaries for Democracy, U.S. Aid for Global Pluralism. Again, like the whole headline makes no sense. Democracy is self-determination. There's no way you can promote self-determination in another country except by keeping your hands off of it. That's the only way you could do it.
What actually happened is that starting in 1989 and 1990, the United States and Germany repeatedly, explicitly represented to Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward towards the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union disbands the Warsaw Pact in Romania. Then in 2008, okay, drum roll, the U.S. insists that Ukraine and Georgia will be members. And if you look at a map, all they're doing is playing out Brzezinski's plan to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Because with Ukraine and Georgia, you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia completely surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. That's the plan. It's not even subtle. So Putin said in 2007, look, we want to cooperate, we're trying to cooperate, but don't keep expanding NATO, because you said not 1 inch eastward, and now you have, it's 10 countries, and now it's going to be 12, and then it's going to be 14, and you're surrounding us. Okay, again, the United States didn't listen. But there was bad luck for the U.S., which is the Ukrainian people did not want NATO expansion. If you look at the opinion surveys, and just go on Wikipedia to take a look, because they're all collated in Wikipedia, the surveys at each date, about 10 surveys, large majorities against NATO enlargement. And President Viktor Yanukovych was elected and became president in 2010, and he pushed for Ukraine's neutrality. And he pushed for Russia to have a long-term lease till 2042 in Sevastopol and the Black Sea region, where the Russian fleet has been based since 1783. That's a good reason to overthrow him, which is what the U.S. policy became by the end of 2013. So when protests broke out over Yanukovych's delay in signing an EU accession agreement, and whether those protests were originally provoked or originally spontaneous, I'll leave it to Professor Kachanovsky to help us understand. But soon they were militarized and paramilitarized by really violent groups, especially from Western Ukraine. And we know from a taped intercept on February 6th, 2014, Victoria Nuland discussing who the next government is going to be 2 weeks later.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU. I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tynybok and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tynybok on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
I'm obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something.
And she describes on the tape her partners back in Washington. Who are they? The Veep, that's Joe Biden, and the Veep's National Security Advisor, that's Jake Sullivan. So the team is the same team as in power right now that played the overthrow of Yanukovych. Now, when the overthrow occurred, I got a call, come to Kiev and meet the new government. And when a government asks, I went. And when I went, the Maidan was still swirling with people, and a U.S. person explained to me, how the U.S., they were so proud how the U.S. had helped finance these demonstrations. This was an NGO explaining how much money they had put into financing the demonstrations. It made me sick, by the way, to know this. The contrivance and the role of the United States in the overthrow. Okay, we're not allowed to talk about any of that, so please keep this to ourselves. It's just 467 of us. But you will not read about this at all. Then we know the war broke out, not in February 2022. The war broke out in February 2014. And again, Professor Kachanovsky is by far the authority on what happened in Odessa, what happened in Crimea, what happened in the Donbass. But already this was civil war, and already by 2015, NATO was pouring in weapons. And there was a UN-backed attempt at peace, especially the Minsk II agreement, and supposedly co-guaranteed by France and Germany. And the Ukrainians brazenly, this new Ukrainian US NATO-backed government just said, we're not implementing that. So they signed it, they didn't implement it. Angela Merkel said a few months ago in a quite notorious interview, no, it was just to buy time for Ukraine so it could strengthen itself. Well, billions of dollars of weapons went in, Biden came into office and Putin put forward a draft security agreement in December 2021 that was to be an agreement between NATO and Russia on security arrangements, calling for, at the center, stopping the enlargement. I spoke to White House officials, a senior White House official at the end of 2021. I said, avoid the war, for heaven's sake, stop the NATO enlargement. Do you get it? This has been the issue all along. And I was told, never, we will never negotiate over that issue. NATO has a, quote, open door, just like I'm sure we'd say with Mexico if it allies with China. I can't say the real word that applies to this because it's not in polite company, but this is not grown-up behavior. This is provocation of war. So in the middle of January 2022, the U.S. formally rejected any discussion about NATO enlargement. And if you read the minutes of Russia's National Security Council meeting on the eve of the invasion, and the meeting took place, I believe it was the 21st of February, you can see all the statements. They're all about NATO. Putin opens, he says, we tried to stop NATO enlargement, but they weren't serious, and the United States is without any credibility whatsoever. And then Lavrov speaks next, and he describes the negotiating process and how it failed, and that the NATO countries were unwilling to discuss the disposition of NATO. Okay, that's the war. The war broke out. Within a month, Zelensky said, you know, maybe we could be neutral. And negotiations started in Ankara with Turkish mediation. And I spoke to the Turkish mediators. I spoke to people who were deeply involved in this. There was rapid progress made on the basis of Ukrainian neutrality. Then, one day, the Ukrainians showed up and said, no, we're taking a pause from the negotiations. The best estimate given to us by former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett in a very interesting long interview that he gave online a couple of months ago said, yeah, the U.S. stopped it. He said, I didn't agree with them, but they thought that they needed to be tough towards China, that it would be a sign of weakness to go along with this. Honest to God. Honestly, it's worse than 5-year-olds. And so the war continued, the negotiations ended, we've had another year. They don't care about the lives lost in Washington. They don't care. Even Romney wrote an article saying this war is great. Russia is losing, Russia's being bled, and not one American life is being lost. He actually had the stupidity to write that, or the evil to write that. Okay, that's the story. If we want this war to end, we got to negotiate, and it's got to be based on no NATO enlargement. There is no other way this war will end. Why? Because if Ukraine is victorious on the battlefield, Russia will use nuclear weapons. And if Ukraine fails on the battlefield, well, the whole thing's moot. And the third option is the war goes on forever, which is American-style wars. Yeah, sure, we can just fight forever.
That the use of force can only be considered legitimate if the decision is made in NATO or in the European Union or in the UN. If he really thinks so, then we have different points of view with him. Or, I misheard. The use of force can be considered legitimate only if such a decision was made on the basis and within the framework of the UN. And there is no need to replace the United Nations with either by NATO or by the European Union. We also cannot but be alarmed by the plans to deploy elements of an anti-missile defense system in Europe. Who needs another round of the inevitable arms race in this case? So-called light American forward bases of 5,000 bayonets each appeared in Bulgaria and Romania. It turns out that NATO is pushing its advanced forces to our state borders, and we, strictly complying with the treaty, do not react to these actions in any way. I think it's obvious that the process of NATO enlargement has nothing to do with the modernization of the alliance itself or with security in Europe. On the contrary, it is a serious provoking factor. That reduces the level of mutual trust.
That NATO expansion, the EU expansion, the US support for the parallel revolutions, this has just provoked Russia. Now, for the last 10 years, you've been demonized by so many people, even though that lecture is now, by the way, at 30 million views on YouTube. But wasn't it striking? I mean, you must have felt it odd when Stoltenberg, the leader in NATO, basically conceded that NATO expansion had provoked Russia.
The Stoltenberg comment was truly amazing. I mean, as you correctly said, I've been kind of a lone voice in the wilderness. But NATO expansion was the heart and soul of the problem from the Russian point of view. And that's what provoked the war on February 24th, 2022. But what's happened now is Jens Stoltenberg, who is the head of NATO, has come out and said in considerable detail exactly what I have been arguing since 2014.
How do you account for this?
I can't. I'm very thankful, for sure, because you can point to it and I can point to it as evidence that I'm not sort of making this up. But let me now turn to the real cause of the Ukraine crisis and ultimately the Ukraine war. The taproot is the American-led effort to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. That strategy has three prongs. One, integrating Ukraine into the EU. Two, turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. You all know about the Orange Revolution. And three, and most importantly, incorporating Ukraine into NATO. The strategy was set in motion at NATO's annual summit in Bucharest in April 2008, when the alliance announced that Ukraine and Georgia will become members. That's in quotes, will become members. Russian leaders responded immediately with outrage, making it clear that this decision was an existential threat to Russia, and they had no intention of letting either country join NATO. According to a respected Russian journalist, Putin, quote, flew into a rage and warned that if Ukraine joins NATO, it will do so without Crimea and the eastern regions. It will simply fall apart. That's Putin talking in 2008. William Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, was then the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. This is at the time of the Bucharest summit. He wrote a memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice that succinctly describes Russian thinking about Ukraine joining NATO. You want to pay very careful attention to what Burns said, and then what I'm going to tell you Angela Merkel has recently said. This is Burns. This is his memo. He's the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. It's his memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. NATO, he said, would be seen as throwing down the strategic gauntlet. Today's Russia will respond. Russian-Ukrainian relations will go into a deep freeze. It will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Burns, of course, was not the only policymaker who understood that bringing Ukraine into NATO was fraught with danger. Indeed, at the Bucharest summit, at the summit itself, both German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Nicolas Sarkozy were opposed to moving forward on NATO membership for Ukraine because they feared it would infuriate Russia. Angela Merkel recently explained her opposition in an interview. I'm quoting Angela Merkel, I was very sure that Putin is not going to let this happen. From his perspective, that would be a declaration of war. Think about what Merkel, who opposed it in April 2008, is saying. She's saying that she knew that Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war. In other words, putting Ukraine in NATO would be a declaration of war. And Burns has just told you that Putin's not an anomaly, that every Russian member of the foreign policy elite, including the knuckle draggers in the recesses of the Kremlin that he has talked to, view it just as Putin views it. The Bush administration, which was pushing this policy decision for NATO, however, cared little about Moscow's brightest of red lines and pressured the French and German leaders to agree to issuing a public pronouncement that said unequivocally that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. Unsurprisingly, the American-led effort to integrate Georgia into NATO resulted in a war between Georgia and Russia in August 2008, just 4 months after the Bucharest summit. Nevertheless, in the wake of that war, the United States and its allies continued moving forward with their plans to make Ukraine a Western bastion on Russia's borders. These efforts eventually sparked a major crisis in February of 2014, after a U.S.-supported uprising caused Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, to flee the country. He was replaced by pro-American Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. In response, Russia took Crimea from Ukraine and helped fuel a civil war that broke out in the Donbass between pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government. One often hears the argument, I'm sure you've all heard this, that in the 8 years between when the crisis broke out in February 2014 and when the war began in February 2022. You see that 8-year window there? Just to keep the big picture in your mind. August 2008, that's the Bucharest summit. But the crisis doesn't break out until February 2014. And then the war breaks out 8 years later, February 2022. The argument is that in the 8 years between when the crisis broke out and when the war broke out, this past February, the United States and its allies paid little attention to bringing Ukraine into NATO. In effect, the issue had been taken off the table, and thus NATO enlargement could not possibly have been an important cause of the escalating crisis in 2021 and the subsequent outbreak of war earlier this year. This line of argument is false. In fact, the Western response to the events of 2014 was to double down on the existing strategy and effectively make Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. The alliance began training the Ukrainian military in 2014, averaging 10,000 trained troops annually over the next 8 years. NATO was training 10,000 troops per year for 8 straight years. In December 2017, the Trump administration decided to provide Kyiv with defensive weapons. Other NATO countries quickly got into the act, shipping even more weapons to Ukraine. In addition, Ukraine's military participated in joint military exercises with NATO forces. In July 2021, less than a year ago, Kyiv and Washington co-hosted Operation Sea Breeze, a naval exercise in the Black Sea that included navies from 31 countries and was directly aimed at Russia. 2 months later, in September 2021, the Ukraine Army led Rapid Trident 21, which was, according to an official press release from the U.S. Army, it was, quote, a U.S. Army Europe and Africa assisted annual exercise designed to enhance interoperability among allied and partner nations. Remember, I'm making the argument here we were turning Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO. It was designed to enhance interoperability among allied and partner nations to demonstrate units are poised and ready to respond to any crisis. NATO's efforts to arm and train Ukraine's military explains in good part why it has fared so well against Russian forces in the ongoing war. It's not simply Russian incompetence, it's the fact that we armed and trained those Ukrainian forces and turned them into a formidable fighting force. A headline in a recent issue of the Wall Street Journal put it quite nicely. This is quoting that headline in the Wall Street Journal. The secret of Ukraine's military success, years of NATO training. Years of NATO training. In addition to NATO's ongoing efforts to make the Ukrainian military a formidable fighting force, the politics surrounding Ukraine's membership in NATO and its integration into the West changed in 2021. There was renewed enthusiasm for pursuing Ukrainian membership in NATO in 2021. And the change took place in both Kyiv and in Washington. Let me start by telling you what happened in Kyiv. President Zelensky, who had never shown much enthusiasm for bringing Ukraine into NATO, and who was elected in March 2019 on a platform that called for working with Russia to settle the ongoing crisis, reversed course in early 2021 and not only embraced NATO expansion, but also adopted a hardline approach toward Moscow. He made a series of moves like shutting down pro-Russian TV shows and stations and arresting an especially close friend of Putin and charging him with treason. These were all moves that were sure to anger Moscow. President Biden, who moved into the White House in January 2021, Biden is moving into the White House just as Zelensky is beginning to do a flip on his views towards Ukraine and towards Russia. President Biden had long been committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO and was also super hawkish towards Russia. And you want to remember that when he was vice president in the Obama administration, President Obama assigned him, Joe Biden, with the Ukraine portfolio. So he was no stranger to this issue. Unsurprisingly, on June 14th, 2021, about a year ago, almost a year ago to the day, NATO issued the following communique at its annual Brussels summit. I'm going to quote, we reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance, as an integral part of the process. We reaffirm all elements of that decision. We reaffirm all elements of that decision, as well as subsequent decisions, including that each partner will be judged on its own merits. We stand firm in our support for Ukraine's right to decide its own future and foreign policy course, free from outside interference. On September 1st, 2021, Zelensky visited the White House, where Biden made it clear in his public statements that the United States was, quote, firmly committed to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Then on November 10th, 2021, Secretary of State Tony Blinken and his Ukrainian counterpart signed an important document. It's called the U.S.-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership. It's available on the website or on the internet if you're interested. This is what it says. The aim of both parties is to, quote, underscore a commitment to Ukraine's implementation of the deep and comprehensive reforms necessary for full integration into Europe and Euro-Atlantic institutions. That document explicitly builds not just on, quote, the commitments made to strengthen the Ukraine-U.S. strategic partnership by Presidents Zelensky and Biden, end of quotes, but it also reaffirms the U.S. commitment to the, quote, 2008 Bucharest Summit Declaration. In short, there is little doubt that starting in early 2021, Ukraine began moving rapidly toward joining NATO. Some argue that while that may be true, it should not have concerned Russian policymakers. We have decided it shouldn't have concerned Russian policymakers. Why? Because NATO is a defensive alliance and poses no threat to Russia. But that's not how Putin and other Russian leaders think about NATO. And it is what they think, not what you think or I think, that matters. And they see NATO as a direct threat. They see NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. They see it as the brightest of red lines. To deal with this growing threat, Putin stationed ever-increasing numbers of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders between February 2021 and February 2022. You remember last year? The number of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders continually increased and increased and increased. You ask yourself, why was that happening? It was happening in response to what Zelensky and Biden were doing, and all the arming and training was taking place. You noticed all those military exercises I described took place in 2021. Putin's aim was to coerce Biden and Zelensky into altering course and putting an end to their efforts to integrate Ukraine into the West. On December 17th, 2021, the Russians reached the boiling point, and Moscow sent separate letters to NATO and to Biden. Many of you, I'm sure, remember when the Russians sent those letters to Biden and to NATO, demanding a written guarantee that, number one, Ukraine would not join NATO, no offensive weapons would be stationed near Russia's borders, and three, NATO troops and equipment moved into Eastern Europe since 1997 would be moved back to Western Europe. Putin made numerous public statements during this period that left no doubt that he viewed NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. Speaking to the Defense Ministry Board on December 21st, 2021, he stated, this is quoting Putin, what they are doing or trying or planning to do in Ukraine is not happening thousands of kilometers away from our national border. It's on the doorstep of our house. They must understand that we simply have nowhere further to retreat to. Do they really think we do not see these threats? Or do they think that we will just stand idly by watching threats to Russia emerge? 2 months later, at a press conference on February 22nd, 2022, this is 2 days before they invade, Putin said, quote, "We are categorically opposed to Ukraine joining NATO because this poses a threat to us, and we have arguments to support this. I have repeatedly spoken about it in this hall." He then made it clear that he recognized that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. The United States and its allies, he said, quote, "continue to pump the current Kiev authorities full of modern types of weapons," end of quote. He went on to say that if this was not stopped, Moscow, quote, "would be left with an anti-Russia armed to the teeth. This is totally unacceptable." Putin's logic should be manifestly clear to Americans in the audience who have long understood, I'm sure, that we have a Monroe Doctrine which stipulates that no great power is allowed to place any of its military forces in the Western Hemisphere. I might note that in all of Putin's public statements during the months leading up to the war, there is not a scintilla of evidence that he was contemplating conquering Ukraine and making it part of Russia, much less attacking other countries in Eastern Europe. Other Russian leaders, including the defense minister, the foreign minister, the deputy foreign minister, and the Russian ambassador to Washington, the Russian ambassador to Washington, also emphasized the centrality of NATO expansion for causing the Ukraine crisis. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made the point succinctly at a press conference on January 14th, 2022, when he said, "The key to everything," I'm quoting Lavrov now, "the key to everything is the guarantee that NATO will not expand eastward." Nevertheless, the efforts of Lavrov and Putin to get the United States and its allies to abandon their efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border failed completely. Secretary of State Tony Blinken responded to Russia's mid-December demands by simply saying, quote, "There is no change, there will be no change." Putin then launched an invasion of Ukraine to eliminate the threat he saw from NATO.
The story. If we want this war to end, we got to negotiate, and it's got to be based on no NATO enlargement. There is no other way this war will end. Why? Because if Ukraine is victorious on the battlefield, Russia will use nuclear weapons. And if Ukraine fails on the battlefield, well, the whole thing's moot. And the third option is the war goes on forever, which is American-style wars. Yeah, sure, we can just fight forever.